What would you do if the family who once mocked you suddenly called, not to apologize, not to reconnect, but to demand millions from you, as if you owed them everything? My name is Mabel, and I am 34 years old, but in many ways I feel much older, like someone who has already lived several different lives inside one. 3 days ago, something happened that forced all those lives to collide at once. My phone rang late in the evening, and when I looked at the screen, I saw a name I hadn't seen in 8 long months: my mother. For a brief second, something inside me softened. Maybe she was calling to ask how I was doing. Maybe she finally wanted to hear about her grandchildren, the ones she had never visited, never held, never even asked about. But that moment of hope disappeared the second I answered the call. Her voice wasn't warm, wasn't hesitant, wasn't even curious. It was direct, controlled, and strangely urgent. She didn't ask me a single question about my life. She didn't ask if I was happy, if I was healthy, or if her grandchildren were growing up well. Instead, she went straight to the point, as if the past 8 months of silence had never existed. She told me that I needed to sell my husband's land, not consider it, not think about it needed. She said the number like it was nothing, like it was just another figure in a conversation that didn't require emotion. $3 million. And we had 2 weeks to get it. 2 weeks to give up the land that my husband and I had built our entire life around, the land that held our memories, our hard work, our children's future, and the reason to save the family from bankruptcy. The same family who once made it very clear that I was no longer one of them. The same mother who didn't invite me to Christmas dinner because my husband didn't fit in. The same people who looked at my life and decided it was beneath them. Now suddenly they needed us. As I stood there holding the phone, I felt a strange mix of emotions rising inside me. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something deeper that I didn't want to name. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the audacity of the request, the assumption that I would simply obey, that I would sacrifice everything without question, just because they were family. That word echoed in my mind, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt distant, almost hollow, like something that had lost its meaning over time. I realized in that moment that this call wasn't just a request. It was a test, one that would force me to decide who I was now and what I was willing to protect. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I couldn't just say yes. Before that phone call, before the demand for money, there was a long history of quiet cruelty that I had tried for years to ignore, excuse, or simply survive. My family didn't wake up one day and suddenly decide to look down on me. It had been building slowly, almost invisibly, from the moment I chose a life that didn't match their expectations. When I first introduced Ethan to them, I still believed that love, sincerity, and kindness would be enough. I thought if they could just see him the way I did, everything would fall into place. But I underestimated how deeply they valued status, appearances, and the illusion of success over anything real. My mother didn't insult Ethan directly at first. She didn't need to. Her tone said everything. The way she looked at his clothes, his hands, the way he spoke, it was all measured against a standard he had never tried to meet. And in her eyes, he failed instantly. My sister Clarissa was less subtle. She had always been the kind of person who hid cruelty behind humor, delivering sharp comments, with a smile that made it hard to call her out without seeming overly sensitive. She would joke about farm life, as if it were some kind of temporary phase I would eventually grow out of, as if I had chosen a costume instead of a life. Her husband Derek didn't even bother pretending. He made it clear from the beginning that he thought Ethan was beneath him, beneath all of us. The words he used stayed with me longer than I ever admitted. Glorified dirt digger, he once said, laughing as if it were harmless. I laughed too, or at least I pretended to, because I didn't know how to defend the man I loved without turning the entire room against me. And that became my role for years, smiling, deflecting, minimizing, telling myself it wasn't that bad. But it was. It showed up in the small things first. Invitations that didn't include Ethan, conversations that stopped when we entered the room. The way my mother would introduce me to her friends, carefully omitting any mention of what my husband actually did, as if it were something to be hidden. Then it became more obvious. We weren't invited to family holidays anymore. Christmas dinners happened without us. Photos were taken without us. Stories were told about us, without us there to correct them. I heard through relatives that my nieces had been told I had married beneath me, that I had thrown away my future for a simpler life. That word simpler was always said with a kind of pity that felt heavier than outright judgment. What hurt the most wasn't just the exclusion, it was the certainty behind it. They truly believed they were right. They believed I had made a mistake, that my life was something to be quietly mourned rather than respected. And over time, I started to question myself. Not my love for Ethan, never that, but everything else. Had I really thrown everything away? Was I blind to something they could see? Clearly, that doubt didn't come from nowhere. It was planted, watered, and allowed to grow by the people who were supposed to support me the most. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in moments, small but sharp, until eventually I realized something I couldn't unsee. I was trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. And no matter how much I explained, defended, or proved myself, it would never be enough, because the problem wasn't my life. It was their definition of what a life should be. There was a time when my life followed a path, so clear, so carefully designed, that I never thought to question it. I was the version of myself my mother proudly presented to the world, the daughter who fit perfectly into the narrative she had spent years constructing. I had graduated from Columbia, one of the most prestigious universities, and stepped directly into a role as a junior analyst at a boutique investment firm in Manhattan. It was the kind of job that came with long hours, high expectations, and the constant pressure to prove that you belonged in a room filled with people who measured success in numbers and status. But at the time, I thrived in it. I wore tailored suits, learned to speak the language of markets and deals, and convinced myself that this was what ambition looked like. My mother loved it. At every social gathering, every garden party, every dinner, where appearances mattered more than connection, she would bring me up as if I were her greatest achievement. "My Mabel," she would say, swirling her wine glass with a satisfied smile, "she's going to run Wall Street someday." And I believed her. Not because I had deeply examined that dream, but because it had been repeated to me so often that it began to feel like truth. My future was already mapped out in neat, predictable lines: climb the corporate ladder, secure a corner office, marry someone with the right last name and the right financial standing, and maintain the image of success that my family valued above everything else. It wasn't that I was unhappy, at least not in a way I could clearly identify. It was more like a quiet exhaustion, that I ignored a feeling that something was slightly off, but not enough to justify stepping away. The city itself mirrored that energy. Manhattan moved fast, always forward, always demanding more. The air felt heavy with ambition, and every conversation seemed to revolve around what came next, what deal was closing, what promotion was coming, what opportunity could be leveraged. I learned to keep up, to push through the fatigue, to treat burnout like a badge of honor instead of a warning sign. Weekends became rare breaks, filled with just enough rest to prepare for another week of intensity. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a growing sense that I was living a life that had been chosen for me rather than by me. I didn't question it out loud because everything on the surface looked exactly right. I was successful. I was respected. I was exactly who I was supposed to be. But there was no room in that life for anything imperfect, anything messy, anything real. It was all polished, controlled, and carefully curated. Looking back now, I can see how much of my identity was tied to meeting expectations that weren't truly mine. I had become an expert at performing the role of the perfect daughter, the ambitious professional, the person everyone assumed I would always be. And the more I succeeded in that role, the harder it became to imagine stepping outside of it. Because walking away wouldn't just mean changing careers or location. It would mean challenging everything my family believed about success, everything they had taught me to value. At the time, I wasn't ready to face that kind of shift. I thought the path I was on was permanent, inevitable even. I didn't know that one unexpected encounter, one conversation in a place far removed from boardrooms and balance sheets, would begin to unravel everything I thought I knew about myself and the life I was meant to live. I didn't plan to meet Ethan. If anything, that weekend was supposed to be an escape from everything my life had become. The city had started to feel suffocating, not in an obvious way, but in a slow, creeping sense that I was constantly running without ever arriving anywhere that actually mattered. So I drove upstate telling myself it was just for a short break, a chance to breathe air that didn't smell like exhaust and ambition. The farmer's market was something I stumbled upon almost by accident. It wasn't part of any carefully planned itinerary. Just a cluster of wooden stalls set up in an open space, filled with people who seemed to exist outside the urgency I was used to. There was a calmness there that immediately felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. I remember walking past tables, covered in fresh produce, handmade goods, and simple things that somehow felt more real than anything I had seen in months. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing behind a wooden table, stacked with tomatoes and bundles of herbs, wearing a faded flannel shirt and boots that were clearly worn from actual work. There was nothing polished about him, nothing that matched the world I came from, and yet there was something about the way he carried himself that made it impossible to look away. When he spoke to customers, he didn't rush, didn't perform, didn't try to impress. He simply explained things: how the soil affected the flavor, why certain crops were planted together, what the weather had done to this season's harvest. His voice was steady, grounded, and completely uninterested in whether or not anyone found it impressive. That more than anything drew me in. I found myself asking questions I didn't even know I cared about, lingering longer than I intended, listening to him talk about things that had nothing to do with profit margins or market trends. And for the first time in a long time, I felt present, not calculating, not anticipating the next step, just there. I told myself it was a one-time experience, something different to break the routine. But the next weekend I went back. And the weekend after that. Each time I found myself standing at the same stall, talking to the same man who seemed completely unaffected by the kind of life I was living. He never asked what I did in a way that felt like judgment or curiosity about status. He didn't seem impressed when I mentioned my job, and strangely, that made me feel more at ease than any approval ever had. With Ethan, conversations didn't feel like transactions. They felt like something real, something that existed without needing to prove its worth. When I finally decided to bring him home, to meet my family, part of me already knew what would happen. I knew he didn't fit into the world they had built, didn't match the image they had of what my life should look like. But another part of me still hoped that they would see what I saw, that they would recognize the quiet strength, the intelligence, the depth that didn't need to announce itself. I was wrong. The moment my mother looked at him, I saw the judgment settle in. Not loud, not dramatic, but immediate and undeniable. She didn't see the man I had come to know. She saw what he represented: a life that didn't align with her expectations, a future she couldn't control. And in that moment, I realized that meeting Ethan wasn't just the beginning of a relationship. It was the beginning of a shift, one that would pull me further and further away from everything I had once believed was certain. Bringing Ethan into my family's world was like placing something real into a space built entirely on appearances, and the contrast was immediate, sharp, and impossible to ignore. I had hoped, maybe naively, that if they spent enough time with him, if they listened, if they paid attention beyond the surface, something would shift. But from the very beginning, it was clear that they had already made their judgment. My mother was the first to speak, though. She did it with that controlled politeness she used when she wanted to appear gracious while still maintaining distance. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. She asked Ethan what he did, and when he answered simply that he was a farmer, I saw the flicker of disappointment she tried and failed to hide. It wasn't just that she didn't understand his work, it was that she had already decided it didn't matter. In her world, value was tied to titles, income, and how easily a person could be introduced in a room full of people who cared about those things. Ethan didn't fit that script, and therefore in her mind he didn't fit at all. Clarissa, on the other hand, didn't bother with subtlety. She treated the entire situation like entertainment, as if my relationship was something amusing rather than something real. She would ask Ethan questions that sounded innocent on the surface, but were clearly designed to highlight the gap between his life and ours. "So do you plan to expand?" she once asked, tilting her head with a smile that felt rehearsed. "Or is farming more of a lifestyle choice?" The pause before those last words said everything. Derek took it even further. He saw no reason to hide his disdain, especially in front of an audience. At our engagement party, Surrounded by people my mother had invited to showcase what she considered a milestone event, he made a point of drawing attention to every difference. He arrived late in a luxury car, making sure everyone noticed. Then walked over to Ethan with a handshake that was more of a performance than a greeting. His eyes dropped immediately to Ethan's boots, taking in the worn leather, the marks of real labor. "Nice boots," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Do they come with the tractor?" A few people laughed, the kind of polite, uncomfortable laughter that tries to smooth over something that shouldn't have been said. Ethan didn't react the way they expected. He didn't get defensive or embarrassed. He simply smiled and answered calmly, turning the moment into something that didn't belong to Derek anymore. But I felt it. I felt every word, like it was aimed not just at him, but at me. At the choice I had made. My mother's toast that night was the moment everything became undeniable. She stood in front of the room, glass raised, and for a second, I allowed myself to hope that she might say something supportive, something that acknowledged the life I had chosen. Instead, she spoke about independence, about strong will, and then she paused in a way that made the entire room lean in. She said she hoped that in a few years I wouldn't regret throwing away everything I had worked for. She didn't have to say Ethan's name. The implication was clear. The life I was building with him was in her eyes a mistake waiting to reveal itself. That was the moment I understood something I had been trying not to see. This wasn't temporary disapproval. It wasn't something that would fade with time or familiarity. It was a fundamental difference in how we saw the world, in what we believed gave a life meaning. And no matter how much I wanted them to accept him, to accept us, I couldn't force them to value something they had already decided was beneath them. The decision to leave everything behind didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. But when it finally came, it felt absolute. It was built from all the small moments that had accumulated over time, every look, every comment, every quiet dismissal that made it clear I no longer belonged in the life I had once been so certain of. That night, after the engagement party, after my mother's words had settled into something heavy and impossible to ignore, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that I was standing at a crossroads. I could stay where I was, continue chasing a version of success that had been handed to me, keep trying to earn approval from people who had already decided I wasn't enough. Or I could choose something else entirely, something uncertain, something that didn't come with guarantees or validation from anyone but myself. The fear was real. Walking away meant giving up everything I had worked for, the career, the identity, the path that had been laid out so clearly in front of me. It meant stepping into a life that from the outside looked like a step down, a compromise, even a failure. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying would cost me something even greater. It would cost me the chance to live honestly. So I made the choice. I left New York. I walked away from the job that had once defined me, from the city that had shaped me, from the expectations that had held me in place for so long. And I chose Ethan. Vermont didn't greet us with ease or instant comfort. The land we bought was beautiful, but it was also demanding in ways I had never experienced. It wasn't polished or convenient. The house needed work, the kind of work that couldn't be solved with money alone, but required time, effort, and patience. There were mornings when the cold felt sharper than anything I had known in the city, days when everything seemed to go wrong at once, when the reality of what we had chosen pressed heavily on both of us. But there was also something else, something I had never felt before, a sense of ownership, not just of the land, but of my own life. Ethan approached everything with a steady determination that grounded me. He didn't expect things to be easy, and because of that, he wasn't shaken when they weren't. He worked from sunrise to sunset, building something piece by piece, never rushing, never cutting corners. And slowly, I learned to do the same. I learned how to read the soil, how to understand the rhythm of the seasons, how to find meaning in work that didn't produce immediate results, but built something lasting over time. It was different from anything I had known, and at first it was overwhelming. There were moments when I questioned myself, when the voice of my family echoed in my mind, asking if this was the mistake they had always predicted. But those moments became less frequent as something else took their place. Satisfaction. Not the kind that came from external validation or recognition, but something quieter, deeper. It came from seeing the results of our work, from knowing that what we were building was real, tangible, and ours. Over time, the life that had once felt uncertain began to feel like the only one that made sense. And the version of myself I had left behind, the one defined by expectations and appearances, started to feel like someone I had outgrown. What we built in Vermont didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't come easily, but over time it became something far more meaningful than anything I had left behind. In the beginning, every day felt like a test. There were no shortcuts, no systems already in place to carry us forward. Everything had to be created from the ground up, often quite literally. Ethan approached the land with a kind of respect that I had never seen before. He didn't try to force it into producing results on his timeline. Instead, he worked with it, understanding that growth required patience, consistency, and a willingness to adapt. I learned that alongside him, not from books or structured lessons, but from experience, from mistakes, from paying attention to things I had once considered insignificant. We started small, focusing on quality, rather than scale-growing organic produce that reflected the care we put into it. At first, it was just one farmer's market, a single table, like the one where I had first met him, but this time, it was ours. Standing there together, talking to customers, explaining where the food came from, I felt a quiet pride that was completely different from anything I had felt in my previous career. There were no titles, no performance metrics, no external validation beyond the simple fact that people came back because they trusted what we were offering. Slowly, that trust grew. One market became several. Relationships formed with regular customers, with other farmers, with people who valued the same things we were learning to value. Within a few years, our produce was being sold in multiple markets across the region, and eventually, we were approached by local restaurants that wanted to work directly with us. It wasn't explosive success. It was steady, grounded, built on consistency rather than risk. And in that steadiness, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing: peace. Then came another kind of growth, one that had nothing to do with the business, but changed everything. Our daughter Lily was born on a cold winter morning, her arrival as loud and certain as everything else in our life had become. Holding her for the first time, I felt a shift that went beyond anything I had experienced before. The life we were building was no longer just about us. It was about creating something stable, something real, something that would support her as she grew. A couple of years later, Noah was born, quieter, in nature, but no less transformative. With 2 children, our days became fuller, more demanding, but also richer in ways that couldn't be measured. The farm wasn't just a place of work anymore. It became a home, in the truest sense of the word, a space filled with laughter, exhaustion, small victories, and moments that grounded me in a way my previous life never had. There were still challenges, still days when things didn't go as planned, when the weather didn't cooperate, when exhaustion set in deeper than expected. But those difficulties felt different. They weren't signs that something was wrong. They were part of the process, part of building something that mattered. And through all of it, I realized that happiness wasn't something that appeared once everything was perfect. It was something that grew quietly in the middle of imperfection, in the spaces where effort, love, and purpose came together. The life I had once thought I had lost was replaced by something I never knew I needed, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. For a long time, even as our life on the farm grew stronger and more stable, there was a part of Ethan's world that remained quiet, almost invisible, something he never hid but never chose to highlight either. To everyone around us, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a farmer who worked from sunrise to sunset, someone deeply connected to the land, someone who found meaning in growth that could be seen and touched. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I began to notice it in small ways. At first, things that didn't quite fit the simple narrative others had created about him. There were late nights during our first winter when the farm slowed down, and the days grew shorter. I would find him sitting by the fireplace, not just reading casually, but studying, taking notes sometimes, working through complex calculations that didn't look like anything related to planting or harvesting. When I asked, he would smile and say he was just keeping his mind active, just staying engaged with things he had studied before. I didn't push, not because I wasn't curious, but because there was something in the way he carried that part of himself. Quiet, intentional, not hidden out of shame, but simply not offered, unless it was necessary. Over time, pieces of the truth began to reveal themselves. Conversations that lasted longer than expected calls. He would step outside to take emails that seemed more formal than anything connected to farming. And then one evening, as the snow fell softly outside and the house was wrapped in that stillness that only winter can bring, he told me more. Before the farm, before the markets, before the life we had built together, Ethan had been on a completely different path. He had earned a doctorate in agricultural engineering from a top institution, focusing on precision farming technologies that could transform how food was grown and managed. His research had attracted attention not just from academic circles, but from investors who saw the potential for something much bigger. There had been opportunities to turn his work into something fast, visible, and highly profitable. But he had walked away from that world not because he couldn't succeed in it, but because it didn't align with how he wanted to build something meaningful. The farm wasn't a fallback, it was a choice. And yet, even after choosing that path, he hadn't abandoned his ideas. Instead, he had continued developing them quietly in the background, without the need for recognition or approval. He built something slowly, the same way he approached everything else, with patience, with purpose, without shortcuts. The company he was creating wasn't announced with headlines or attention. It grew through results, through real applications of the technology he had designed, helping other farmers improve efficiency and sustainability in ways that mattered. When he finally told me about it, fully about the systems he had developed, the partnerships he had formed, and the value it had begun to generate, I realized that everything people had assumed about him was incomplete. He wasn't just a farmer, and he wasn't trying to prove he was anything more. He simply was more in a way that didn't need validation. I asked him once why he never told my family, why he let them continue believing what they wanted to believe. He looked at me with a calm certainty and said something that stayed with me. "They don't deserve to know," he said, not with anger, but with clarity. "And I don't need their respect." At the time, I understood the words, but I didn't fully grasp their weight. It wasn't about hiding success. It was about choosing where to place your truth and who had earned the right to see it. And as I looked at the life we had built, at the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, I began to understand that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply exists, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The call from Clarissa didn't come with warning or preparation, and somehow that made it hit even harder. It was late, the kind of quiet night where everything in the house had finally settled. Noah had just fallen asleep after a restless evening, and I was sitting beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, letting the calm of that moment wash over me. When my phone lit up, I almost didn't answer. Seeing her name after 8 months of silence felt like opening a door I had carefully kept closed. But something in me hesitated, then gave in. The moment I heard her voice, I knew this wasn't a normal call. She was crying, not the controlled, strategic kind of tears I had grown used to from her, but something raw and unfiltered. Her words came out uneven, breaking apart under the weight of whatever she was trying to say. She didn't ease into it, didn't ask how I was, didn't pretend this was a reconnection. She went straight to the crisis. They were in trouble. Real trouble. I stepped out into the hallway, closing Noah's door softly behind me, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked what had happened. The story came in fragments at first. Derek had made some bad investments, then worse investments. Then everything had unraveled. The house was gone. The cars were gone. Their savings, everything they had built, was gone. As she spoke, I could hear the disbelief still lingering in her voice, as if she hadn't fully accepted it herself. I leaned against the wall, trying to process the scale of what she was saying. When I finally asked how much, there was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, because the answer is too heavy to say out loud. $3 million, she said, her voice barely holding together. They needed $3 million, and they needed it fast. 2 weeks. The same number my mother had mentioned. It felt like the words echoed, overlapping, closing in. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop even further. My mother had put up her house as collateral, trusting Derek, believing in whatever he had promised. And now that house was on the line too. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The situation was unfolding too quickly, too unreal, to grasp all at once. And then came the request. Not framed as a request, really, more like an expectation. I should sell the land. Just a portion of it, she said, as if that made it reasonable, as if what we had built could be divided so easily. It's just dirt, she added, the words landing harder than she probably realized. Just dirt. I felt something inside me shift at that moment. Not anger, not immediately. Something quieter, colder. That land was not just dirt. It was years of work, of sacrifice, of choosing a different path when everything else would have been easier. It was where my children were growing up, where we had created a life that finally felt like our own. And yet to her, it was something disposable, something to be traded away to fix a problem we hadn't created. I told her I needed time to think, though. Even as I said it, I knew the answer wasn't simple. She didn't take it well. Desperation turned sharp, her voice tightening as she reminded me that we were family, that I owed them. That word again. Owed. It hung in the air long after the call ended. I stood there in the hallway, the house quiet again. But the calm from before was gone. In its place was a storm of thoughts I couldn't yet organize. This wasn't just about money. It was about everything that had led to this moment. Everything that had been said and done over the years. Everything I had chosen to walk away from. And now somehow, it had all circled back, demanding something from me again. That night after the call ended, and the house fell silent again, I couldn't let it go. Something about the way Clarissa had spoken, the urgency, the fragments of information, and especially the mention of Derek's investments, didn't sit right with me. It felt incomplete, like I was only being told the surface of something much deeper. I stayed awake long after Ethan and the kids had gone to sleep. Sitting alone at the kitchen table with my laptop, the soft glow of the screen cutting through the darkness. At first I told myself I was just looking for clarity, just trying to understand how things had gotten so bad, so quickly. But as I started searching, I realized I was also looking for something else. Truth. I typed Derek's name into the search bar, adding keywords related to his work, his firm, anything that might give me context. The first few results were vague, carefully worded articles that said very little while implying much more. Then I found it. A report about his departure from his firm, described as mutual, the kind of language I knew well enough to read between the lines. It wasn't a clean exit. It was a forced one. Something had gone wrong, and it had been serious enough to remove him completely. I kept digging, moving past the polished articles into forums and discussions where people were less careful with their words. That was where the real story began to take shape. There were mentions of aggressive positions, high-risk strategies, and one specific detail that made my hands go still on the keyboard. Derek had taken a massive short position against a company in the agricultural technology space. He had bet heavily that it would fail, not cautiously, not strategically, completely. Everything he had and more. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a bad investment, it was a reckless one, driven by confidence that bordered on arrogance. And then, I saw something that made everything else fall into place. A comment buried deep in a thread, almost easy to miss but impossible to ignore once I saw it. Someone mentioned that the company he had bet against wasn't just any startup. It was one that had recently gained attention for rapid growth, for innovation, that was actually working. The name of the company was familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. My mind started connecting pieces I hadn't even realized were related. The late-night calls Ethan had taken, the work he had quietly continued, the things he had never fully explained but never hidden either. I felt a cold realization begin to settle in. I reached for my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, an old colleague who still worked in the financial world, someone who would know more than what was publicly available. When she answered, her voice was tired, but when I mentioned Derek's name, there was an immediate shift. She didn't need much prompting. She told me what had happened in a way that confirmed everything I had started to piece together. Derek had gone all in. He had bet everything on that company collapsing, and instead it had done the opposite. Its value had surged, growing rapidly, while his position lost more and more with each passing day. By the time he realized he was wrong, it was too late. The losses had already spiraled beyond recovery. He hadn't just lost his own money. He had taken everything down with him, including funds that were never his to risk in the first place. I sat there in silence after the call ended, staring at the table, letting the full weight of it sink in. This wasn't misfortune. It wasn't bad luck. It was a series of choices that had led exactly where they were always going to lead. And for the first time since that night began, I understood that what my family was asking from me wasn't just help. It was a way to escape the consequences of something they had chosen to ignore. The deeper I looked, the harder it became to pretend that this was simply a case of bad judgment or unfortunate timing. There was something else beneath it, something more deliberate. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The information I had already found pointed to recklessness, to arrogance, to a level of risk that no responsible person should have taken, especially not with money that wasn't entirely his. But there was still a missing piece, something that explained why Derek had chosen that specific company, why he had committed so completely to its failure. That answer came in a way I hadn't expected. It was an email forwarded quietly, almost reluctantly, by my former colleague, after she hesitated for a long moment on the phone. She had warned me that I might not like what I was about to read, and she was right. The message was part of an internal conversation that had surfaced during the investigation into Derek's termination. It wasn't written for public eyes. It wasn't polished or careful. It was raw, direct, and revealing in a way that stripped away any remaining doubt. As I read it, I felt something shift inside me. Something sharper than anger. Something colder than disappointment. He didn't just believe the company would fail. He wanted it to fail. The words were unmistakable. He had referred to it as my husband's little farm project, dismissing everything Ethan had built with a kind of casual contempt that now felt painfully familiar. But it didn't stop there. He had written about going all in, about making a fortune off that failure. And then there was the part that stayed with me the most. He had said that seeing the look on my face when everything collapsed would be worth more than the money. I read that line more than once, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. But there was no other way to read it. This wasn't just about profit. It wasn't even just about proving a point. It was personal. He hadn't been trying to outsmart the market. He had been trying to destroy something that mattered to me, something I had chosen over the life he believed I should have lived. And suddenly, everything made sense in a way that felt both clarifying and deeply unsettling. The comments, the jokes, the dismissive looks, the way he had always positioned himself as superior. It had never been harmless. It had been building towards something, feeding into a belief that he could not only look down on our life, but eventually prove that it was a mistake. That I was a mistake. I sat there with the phone in my hand. The screen still lit. The words still visible. And I realized that the situation had shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. This was no longer just about whether I would help my family or not. It was about understanding exactly what I was being asked to support. If I agreed, if I gave them what they wanted, I wouldn't just be helping them recover from a financial loss. I would be erasing the consequences of an intentional act, one that had been driven by spite as much as by greed. That realization didn't make the decision easier. If anything, it made it heavier, because despite everything, they were still my family. The history, the connection, the years of trying to belong, they didn't disappear just because the truth had become clearer. But clarity changes something fundamental. It removes the ability to pretend. And as I sat there holding that truth in my hands, I knew that whatever choice I made next would have to come from a place that was no longer clouded by doubt. It would have to come from knowing exactly what had been done and deciding consciously what I was willing to accept and what I was not. By the time my mother's birthday arrived, I already knew this wasn't going to be a simple family gathering. It had been positioned as a celebration, a milestone, an opportunity to bring everyone together. But underneath that carefully constructed surface, there was something else waiting. I could feel it even before we left the house. Ethan sensed it too, though he didn't say much. He never needed to. There was a quiet understanding between us, a recognition that whatever was about to happen, we would face it together. The restaurant was exactly what I expected. Elegant, controlled, designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers hung above neatly arranged tables. Soft music filled the space without ever demanding attention, and every detail seemed chosen to reinforce a certain image. It was the kind of place where appearances mattered, where conversations were measured, and where people performed versions of themselves that fit the environment. As we walked in, I immediately felt the shift. Conversations paused for a fraction of a second, eyes turned, assessments were made. Not openly, not rudely, but in that subtle way I had grown used to over the years. My mother greeted us at the entrance, her smile precise, her expression carefully balanced between politeness and calculation. She acknowledged Ethan, but only briefly, as if his presence was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Inside, the room was already full. Familiar faces, distant relatives, people from my mother's social circle, and a few individuals I recognized from Derek's professional world. It wasn't just a birthday dinner, it was an audience. That realization settled in slowly but firmly. This wasn't about reconnecting or repairing anything. It was about control. Clarissa was seated near the front. Her composure strained her eyes, carrying the exhaustion of everything she had been dealing with. Derek was there too, though he looked different from the last time I had seen him. Less confident, more rigid, like someone holding himself together through sheer force of will. My father moved around the room, quietly avoiding prolonged eye contact, playing his usual role of staying out of whatever tension was building. And in the corner, my grandmother watched everything with a stillness that suggested she understood far more than anyone else in that room. Dinner moved forward in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Polite conversations, controlled laughter, carefully chosen words that avoided anything too real. But beneath it, there was a tension that never fully disappeared, like a thread running through every interaction. I noticed the way certain people glanced in my direction, the way conversations shifted when I came closer, the way Derek avoided looking at Ethan for too long. It all pointed to something that hadn't been said, yet something waiting for the right moment. That moment came when my mother stood up. The room quieted almost instantly, as if everyone had been expecting it. She raised her glass, began with gratitude, with the kind of practiced warmth she had perfected over the years. She spoke about family, about resilience, about supporting one another in difficult times. On the surface, it sounded appropriate, even sincere. But as she continued, her focus shifted. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the attention toward me. She spoke about my life in a way that reduced it to something small, something simple, something that could be easily used for the purpose she had in mind. And then, without hesitation, she introduced the reason behind the entire evening. A document was brought to the table, placed directly in front of me, its presence undeniable. She explained it in terms that were meant to sound reasonable, even necessary. All I had to do was sign. Just a portion of land, she said, as if it were insignificant, as if it didn't represent everything we had built. The room became very still. Every eye was on me. It wasn't just a request. It was pressure, carefully constructed, publicly applied. They had chosen this setting, this audience, this moment, to make it as difficult as possible for me to refuse. And as I sat there looking at that document, I understood exactly what they were trying to do. For a few seconds after the document was placed in front of me, I didn't move. The silence in the room felt heavier than anything that had been said, as if everyone present was holding their breath, waiting for me to follow the script that had already been written for me. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. It wasn't just my mother standing there with her glass raised, watching me carefully. It was every guest, every pair of eyes, measuring what kind of daughter I would choose to be in that moment. The obedient one, who would keep the peace, or the one who would disrupt everything that had been so carefully arranged. I looked down at the document, then slowly back up, letting my gaze move across the room. And in that moment, something inside me settled. Not anger, not panic, but clarity. Instead of reaching for the pen, I stood up. The movement alone shifted the atmosphere. A few people straightened in their seats, sensing that something wasn't going to go the way they expected. I kept my voice calm, steady, the way I had learned to speak in rooms where control mattered. But this time, it wasn't about control. It was about truth. I said I had a question before I made any decision. It was directed at Derek. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. A tightening in his expression, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. He tried to brush it off, to redirect, to make it seem unnecessary. But I didn't let it go. I asked him to explain clearly and honestly how he had lost everything. The room shifted again, the tension sharpening. My mother stepped in, attempting to steer the moment back to where she wanted it, insisting that it wasn't relevant, that this wasn't the time. But I held my ground. If I was being asked to give up everything we had built, then the truth mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone sitting in that room. When Derek refused to answer, I did it for him. I spoke clearly, laying out what I had learned piece by piece without raising my voice. I explained what a short position was, how it worked, and how it could lead to massive losses when the outcome went the wrong way. At first, some people looked confused, others uncomfortable, but as I continued, understanding began to spread. Then I read the message. The words he had written, unfiltered, undeniable. I didn't need to add anything to them. They spoke for themselves. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Gasps, whispers, the sound of people shifting in their seats, as the reality of what they were hearing settled in. This wasn't just a bad investment. It was intentional. It was targeted. And it was personal. I watched as the image Derek had built for himself in that room began to crack. The confidence, the superiority, the sense of control, it all started to fall away under the weight of the truth. But I didn't stop there. I revealed the final piece, the part that changed everything. The company he had bet against hadn't failed. It had grown. It had succeeded beyond expectations. And the person behind it, the person he had underestimated, dismissed, and tried to destroy, was Ethan. I could see the moment it registered the shift in the room as people connected the dots. The quiet farmer they had barely acknowledged was suddenly something entirely different, not because he had changed, but because the truth had finally been seen. And just like that, the narrative they had held onto for so long collapsed. After the truth settled over the room and the weight of everything I had revealed began to sink in, there was a shift that no one could ignore. The energy that had once been filled with quiet judgment and controlled superiority was replaced by something far more uncertain. People weren't looking at me the same way anymore, and they certainly weren't looking at Ethan the same way. But despite all of that, the decision in front of me hadn't changed. The document was still there, the expectations still lingering, even if the confidence behind it had been shaken. I could see it in my mother's face. The certainty she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something fragile, something that wavered between pride and desperation. She spoke again, but this time her voice was different, softer, less commanding, almost pleading. She tried to shift the narrative to bring it back to family, to remind me of what we were supposed to mean to each other. But the word didn't hold the same weight anymore, not after everything that had come to light. I looked at the document one more time, then closed it and set it aside. The gesture was simple, but it carried everything I needed to say. I wasn't signing. Not now. Not under pressure. Not for the reasons they had given. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't expectant. It was unsettled. Clarissa looked at me with disbelief, her expression caught somewhere between anger and fear. She asked if I was really going to let everything fall apart, if I was truly willing to walk away when I had the ability to fix it. Her words were sharp, but beneath them was panic. My mother didn't say anything at first. She just stared as if trying to understand how the situation had slipped out of her control. And then Ethan stood up. He had remained quiet through most of it, allowing me to speak, allowing the truth to unfold in its own way. But now, as the room turned toward him, he stepped forward with the same calm presence he carried everywhere. He made it clear in a voice that didn't need to be raised that we were not selling our land. That decision was final. But then he said something that shifted the moment again. He was willing to help. Not in the way they expected, not by giving them everything they asked for, but in a way that created boundaries instead of erasing them. He offered a loan enough to stabilize the situation enough to give them time to face what had happened without losing everything immediately. But it came with conditions. Clear, direct, and non-negotiable. Derek would have to repay every part of it with accountability built into the agreement. He would need to confront the behavior that had led to this situation, not ignore it or hide from it. And most importantly, this would be the last time we were placed in this position. There would be no future requests, no repeated expectations that we would solve problems that were not ours. The reaction was immediate. Derek rejected it, his pride, unable to accept help that came with accountability. Clarissa tried to hold everything together, caught between her husband and the reality of what they were facing. My mother stood there silent, the decision no longer something she could control. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone in that room. It was about defining what we were willing to stand for, what we were willing to protect, and what we would no longer allow. After that night, everything changed, not in one dramatic instant, but in a series of quiet, irreversible shifts that unfolded over time. The version of my family that had existed for so long, built on image control and unspoken expectations, began to fracture under the weight of truth. Some parts broke completely, others bent just enough to survive, but nothing returned to what it had been before. Clarissa was the first to reach out, though, not in the way I once would have hoped. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been said or done over the years. Instead, there was exhaustion. She told me she and Derek were separating, that the situation had revealed more than just financial loss. There were debts she hadn't known about, decisions made without her patterns she could no longer ignore. Her voice carried a kind of emptiness that didn't leave room for blame, only for realization. I listened, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of distance. This wasn't something I had wanted for her, but it was something she now had to face on her own terms. My mother's response was different. She didn't call. She didn't write. There was no attempt to explain or justify anything that had happened. Instead, there was silence. The kind that speaks not of peace, but of withdrawal. I later learned that she had sold the house, not because she had no other option, but because staying there would have meant confronting everything that had come undone. She moved into a smaller place, one that reflected necessity rather than status. For someone who had spent her entire life curating an image, that shift must have been more difficult than any financial loss. My father surprised me. For years, he had remained in the background, quiet, distant, choosing avoidance over confrontation. But after that night, something changed. He started calling. At first, the conversations were short, awkward, filled with pauses that neither of us quite knew how to fill. He asked about the farm, about the children, about things that seemed simple, but carried more weight than they appeared. And then he kept calling, week after week, consistently, without expectation, without pressure. It wasn't a complete repair, not yet, but it was an effort. An effort I had learned mattered. The most unexpected change came through my grandmother. She didn't wait for an invitation. She arrived at our farm with a suitcase and the same quiet strength she had always carried. She stayed not just for a visit, but long enough to become part of our daily life. She built relationships with my children, shared stories, brought pieces of a past that had once felt distant into the present in a way that felt grounding instead of painful. Through her, I saw a version of family that wasn't defined by expectation or judgment, but by presence, by care, by the simple act of showing up. And in the midst of all of that, I found something I hadn't been looking for, but needed more than I realized. Closure, not in the sense of everything being resolved or forgiven, but in the understanding that not everything needs to be fixed to move forward. Some relationships change, some end. Some rebuild slowly in ways that are different from what they once were. And some remain distant, not out of anger, but out of acceptance. I stopped waiting for my mother to understand me, stopped hoping that one day she would see my life the way I did. That waiting had been holding me in place, without me even realizing it. Letting go of it didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. As I sat on the porch one evening watching Ethan with the children, hearing their laughter carry across the fields, I realized something that had taken years to fully understand. The life I had chosen hadn't taken anything away from me. It had given me everything that truly mattered. Not perfection, not approval, but something far more lasting. A sense of belonging that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. And in that realization, I finally felt at peace. No one sees how hard you've tried until you no longer need to explain yourself. There are days that begin like any other, yet somehow feel heavier than everything you've ever carried. You wake up with a long list of responsibilities, but no real motivation inside. Money feels tight, opportunities seem far away, and the people around you don't truly believe you're capable of something bigger. You watch others move forward, while you feel stuck in place, repeating the same exhausting routine over and over again. Some nights you sit alone under dim light, wondering if all your effort even means anything. You've thought about quitting not just once but many times, because the pressure doesn't only come from life, but also from your own thoughts. You start to doubt yourself, your path, and even the dreams you once believed in completely. Yet deep inside, something refuses to fade, a small, fragile belief that keeps you going just one more day. You keep working, keep learning, keep pushing forward, even when no one is watching. These efforts are not glamorous, not recognized, and they don't bring immediate results. But these are the most important days, because you are building yourself in silence. You are learning endurance, discipline, and how to stand firm, even when nothing supports you. Maybe today you're not successful. Maybe tomorrow won't be either. But every time you refuse to quit, you are moving closer to a stronger version of yourself. And what many people don't understand is this: success doesn't begin when you achieve something. It begins the moment you decide not to stop. You might still be in the hardest phase right now, where everything feels uncertain and unclear. But remember, every success story starts the same way, with loneliness, pressure, and doubt. The only difference is that some people stop while others keep going, without knowing what lies ahead. If you are still trying even just a little every day, then you are already on the right path. These days will pass, but what they teach you will stay forever. After days filled with instability and doubt, something begins to change. Not your circumstances, but you. You start to realize that waiting for things to become easier is an illusion, because life simply doesn't work that way. Instead of asking, "Why is everything so hard for me?" you begin to ask a different question: "What can I do next?" And that small shift in mindset opens up an entirely new path. You stop relying on motivation, because you understand that motivation comes and goes, but discipline is what keeps you moving forward. There are mornings when you wake up feeling exhausted, your mind still heavy with stress, yet you choose to get up anyway. Not because you feel like it, but because you know you have to. You begin to build small habits: waking up a little earlier, doing one more difficult task, pushing yourself one extra hour while others have already stopped. These things may not create an immediate difference, but over time, they accumulate into a strength you never expected. There are still moments when you fail. Plans don't go the way you intended, opportunities slip through your fingers, and there are days when it feels like you've returned to the starting point. But this time, you don't collapse the way you used to. You begin to understand that failure is not the end, but a part of the process. Every time you fall, you learn something new, a lesson about patience, about adjustment, about getting back up faster. Gradually, you realize that you are no longer afraid of failure. You also begin to see the world differently. The doubts and criticisms from others no longer shake you like they once did. You understand that not everyone can see your vision, and that's completely okay. Instead of trying to prove yourself to everyone, you focus on proving it to yourself. Day by day, you become a little stronger, a little more confident, and most importantly, less dependent on external validation. Persistence isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply continuing to do the small things in silence, even when there are no visible results. It's showing up when no one is cheering for you, moving forward, even when the path ahead is unclear. And those seemingly ordinary moments are where the greatest differences are made. Because most people stop when they don't see immediate results, but you don't. Slowly, you begin to notice something important. You are no longer the same person you were at the beginning. You've changed. Not because life has become easier, but because you've become stronger. The challenges that once made you want to quit are now just obstacles for you to overcome. You start to believe in yourself more, not because you've achieved something massive yet, but because you've proven that you can keep going. And then something subtle but powerful happens. Small opportunities begin to appear. Not huge breakthroughs right away, but signs that you are on the right path. A new opportunity, a better result than expected, a small door opening. These things may not change your life overnight, but they are enough to remind you that your efforts are not meaningless. This phase is not about reaching success yet. It's about building the most resilient version of yourself. And once you've made it this far, the only thing left to do is keep going. Because the difference between those who succeed and those who quit is not talent or luck. It's who is willing to persist until the end. After all the silent persistence, there comes a moment when you begin to feel real change. Your efforts are no longer invisible. You start to see small results, receive recognition, and encounter opportunities that never existed before. From the outside, people might call it luck. But deep down, you know this moment was built from countless unseen days of hard work. An inspiring story of rising from struggle to success. A turning point rarely arrives loudly. It comes quietly, sometimes disguised as a small opportunity that you are finally prepared to take. It could be a collaboration, offer a better job, an idea you finally act on, or simply a decision you once feared, but now have the courage to make, and that decision changes everything. Because before, you might have hesitated, but now, you are ready. You begin to realize that nothing you went through was wasted. Discipline helps you stay consistent. Persistence keeps you moving when things are unclear, and past failures become valuable lessons guiding your decisions. Everything starts to connect, forming a solid foundation for you to rise to the next level. At this stage, you clearly see the difference between who you were and who you've become. You no longer hesitate for too long or fear mistakes the way you used to. Instead, you act faster, more decisively, and with greater confidence. It doesn't mean fear is gone. It means you've learned to move forward despite it. And that is true growth. However, a turning point also brings new challenges. As you move forward, expectations rise, pressure increases, and your decisions carry more weight. This is where you must choose return to comfort or continue pushing ahead, knowing it will be harder. But this time, you are no longer the same person. You have enough experience to understand that growth always comes with discomfort. People who once doubted you may start to change their perspective. Some will be surprised, some will admire you, and some still won't believe. But it no longer matters, because at this point you don't need their validation anymore. Your results have become your answer. And then you realize something important. A turning point is not the finish line. It's a doorway to a bigger journey. It proves you can succeed, but also reminds you that there is still more ahead. Success is not a single moment. It is a continuous process of growth. If you are in this phase, remember this. An opportunity only matters if you are brave enough to take it, and you didn't come this far just to stop. This is only the beginning of your strongest self. One day you look back and realize that your life has changed, not in a loud or sudden way, but gradually built over time. The things that once worried you no longer feel overwhelming. The struggles that once made you want to quit have become stories you now tell. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself to anyone because your journey already speaks for itself. Your success is not just about money or status. It's about who you've become, stronger, wiser, and more resilient. You begin to enjoy life in ways you once only imagined. You now have choices what to do, where to be, and who to be with. You are no longer controlled by circumstances like before. But more importantly, it's not just about what you gain. It's about how you see things. You appreciate every opportunity and every achievement because you understand the effort behind them. You stop comparing yourself to others because you know every journey is different. Some people may come back, those who doubted you, underestimated you, or left when you were at your lowest. They may look at you differently now, even try to reconnect. But at this point, you no longer need their validation. You are no longer affected by their opinions. You understand that your worth doesn't come from others, but from everything you've endured. And you learn to choose wisely, keeping only those who truly deserve a place in your life. Success doesn't mean everything becomes perfect. You will still face challenges and new pressures, but you are no longer afraid. Because you've proven to yourself that you can overcome difficulties. You no longer avoid problems. You face them with calmness and confidence. And that is the biggest difference between who you are now and who you used to be. The most beautiful part of this stage is not the destination, but the journey. You begin to understand that all the exhausting days, failures, and lonely moments had meaning. Without them, you wouldn't be who you are today. Instead of forgetting the past, you appreciate it, because it built the foundation of your present self. Finally, you realize that success is not the end. It's just a milestone. There will always be new goals, new journeys, and new challenges ahead. But this time, you move forward with confidence. Not because you are certain you won't fail, but because you know that no matter what happens, you will keep going. And that is the true definition of success.